Brasil é a nossa fonte de inspiração. E os brasileiros, os grandes personagens das histórias que contamos todos os dias, de todos os cantos do país. Existimos para transformar realidades, para ajudar a fazer as perguntas certas com inteligência e distribuir conteúdo de alto nível. Vamos além das notícias. Cobrimos, reverberamos. Tudo para chegar na intimidade de cada história. Histórias que nos revelam, nos aproximam e nos mudam. Investigamos acontecimentos relevantes com detalhamento. Analisamos as diversas faces que compõem todo e qualquer fato. Alcance com profundidade e responsabilidade. Como fazemos? Com diálogo, informação e opinião forte, respeitando a de cada um, refletindo a diversidade que nos faz brasileiros. Somos um canal de troca e interatividade. Saber primeiro, entender melhor. Criar juntos conteúdo para todas as audiências. Nosso propósito é fortalecer a sociedade democrática com jornalismo confiável. Acreditamos na interdependência da sociedade e das instituições. Ajudamos a transformar o Brasil porque nossas histórias mexem com as pessoas. E não é isso que fazem as boas histórias? Somos agentes de mudança e mudamos junto com o país que traduzimos. Inovação é cotidiana. Estamos todos conectados. Somos Brasil. Somos o nosso ontem, o hoje. E estamos comprometidos com o nosso amanhã. Somos Globo.
Há 20 anos, o Santander investe em um futuro mais inclusivo e mais sustentável. Em 2002, criamos o Amigo de Valor, uma mobilização de recursos incentivados para a garantia de direitos de crianças e adolescentes. No mesmo ano, também lançamos o Prospera, a maior operação privada de microcrédito do país. Em 2005, ingressamos no mercado de energia renovável e respondemos por mais de 30% dos projetos eólicos do país. Em 2010, nos tornamos carbono neutro nas nossas operações. Desde 2015, somos parceiros do produtor rural brasileiro na transição para um agronegócio mais sustentável. Em 2020, nos unimos com outros 2 grandes bancos do Brasil com o objetivo de promover o desenvolvimento sustentável da Amazônia. Neste ano, também fortalecemos nossa atuação com fundos patrimoniais filantrópicos. Em 2021, assumimos o compromisso de zerarmos nossas emissões de carbono até 2050. Nos últimos 5 anos, viabilizamos mais de 97 bilhões em negócios sustentáveis. E distribuímos 70 mil bolsas de estudo para universitários. Estamos investindo em um futuro melhor para todos. Acesse www.santander.com.br/sustentabilidade e conheça mais as nossas iniciativas.
Olá, pessoal. Bom dia a todos e a todas. Satisfação imensa receber vocês. E queria dar um bem-vindo especial, né, a essa edição de 2022 do evento Cidadão Global. Esse nosso evento ele é apresentado pelo Santander e pelo Valor Econômico e tem a realização da editora Globo. A gente ficou 2 anos em formato digital, né, por causa da pandemia, e agora a gente está comemorando a volta ao encontro presencial. Então, é um evento muito importante que marca essa retomada. Bom, para quem não me conhece, eu sou o Ronaldo Lemos, sou advogado, sou professor, sou diretor científico do ITS Rio e apresento também o programa Expresso Futuro, que é dedicado à inovação e à tecnologia, temas que, aliás, a gente vai falar hoje, e é exibido no canal Futura e também no Fantástico. Até passou esse domingo passado, não sei quem teve a oportunidade de assistir o programa, dessa vez filmado na África. Bom, eu tenho um interesse imenso, né, nesse tema que a gente vai debater hoje, e por isso vai ser um enorme prazer estar com vocês aqui durante essa manhã, recebendo vários convidados, inclusive, que eu admiro muito, para falar sobre ESG, do discurso à prática. Então, os palestrantes dessa edição que a gente fez dessa vez, eles fazem muita diferença, gerando impactos positivos no planeta. e eles têm muito a acrescentar nesse assunto que hoje chama a atenção das empresas no mundo todo. E a gente acha importantíssimo justamente alertar para a urgência da pauta do ESG, tá? Então, além de reconhecer que o ESG pode gerar vantagens competitivas, né, com a incorporação das dimensões ambientais e sociais aos resultados dos negócios, todas as companhias inteligentes enxergam hoje o ESG como uma oportunidade também de inovação, de mais eficiência e de viabilidade de negócios, inclusive no longo prazo. O Brasil, né, que a gente tem muito recurso natural, a nossa capacidade empresarial e o engajamento da sociedade tem um papel de liderança importantíssimo a desempenhar nessa transição global para uma economia de baixo carbono. E como fazer isso da melhor maneira possível? É sobre questões como essa e os possíveis caminhos para a gente atingir as difíceis metas para a agenda de ESG que a gente vai refletir e discutir nesse fórum hoje. E todo mundo está convidado a participar dessa discussão. Estão vendo esse QR Code aqui no telão? Pessoal, esse é o QR Code que vai permitir fazer perguntas durante todo o evento. Então, eu recomendo pegar o celular, tirar uma fotinha aqui do QR Code e aí já mandem as suas perguntas, porque a gente vai trabalhar elas durante o nosso talk show, que a gente vai fazer um pouquinho mais tarde, tá? Então, pessoal, não sejam tímidos e vamos participar. Bom, agora é hora de dar boas-vindas para o Frederic Kachar, que é diretor-geral de mídia impressa e rádio do Grupo Globo. Por favor, Fred, junte-se a gente.
Bom dia a todas e todos. É uma alegria imensa estar de volta aqui a esse teatro para celebrar a retomada do Cidadão Global no formato presencial. Como o Lemos falou, passamos 2 anos fazendo através de virtual e eu particularmente sou fã dos encontros presenciais, então estamos realmente muito felizes de podermos retomar esse ano. A gente criou o Cidadão Global há 5 anos, sempre em parceria com o Santander Brasil, para abordar as pautas urgentes do século XXI, trazendo sempre as maiores autoridades nos temas que selecionamos para o debate. Logo de cara, na primeira edição, contamos com a presença do presidente Obama, quando tivemos a oportunidade de discutir os desafios da democracia diante dos efeitos da evolução do capitalismo na sociedade, com especial foco na educação e na obrigação de engajarmos os jovens nesse debate e na construção das soluções. A repercussão foi enorme, dominando a pauta da imprensa durante aqueles dias. E, além disso, eu posso dizer que aquele encontro segue atualíssimo nos dias de hoje. Enfim, o fato é que a gente começou fazendo o Cidadão Global com um sarrafo bem alto. E assim seguimos nos anos seguintes, abordando questões como a emergência climática, o risco de uma guerra nuclear, inclusão, diversidade e disrupção tecnológica. Nomes como Yuval Harari, Al Gore, Viola Davis, além de outros pensadores que são autoridades nesses temas, passaram pelo Cidadão Global. Portanto, eu acho que é justo eu afirmar que essa parceria com o Santander, a quem eu aproveito para agradecer aqui hoje, através do seu presidente, Mário Leão, que daqui a pouco estará aqui nesse palco, e sua equipe, Maitê Leite e Bibiana Berg, por essa parceria estratégica e também, claro, pela acolhida carinhosa nesse teatro que tanto nos alegra. Estamos muito orgulhosos de chegar no 5º ano, que é um milestone importante para qualquer evento, na melhor forma e com muitas histórias contadas, porque, afinal de contas, a razão de existir da Editora Globo é para conectar pessoas e histórias. Para esse ano, elegemos como tema a urgência de o setor privado assumir protagonismo na transformação que precisamos acelerar rumo a um modelo mais sustentável, mais diverso, de baixo carbono, mais inclusivo e com rígidos parâmetros de governança. É fato que os temas ligados à sigla ESG deixaram de ser responsabilidade apenas de um departamento para virar uma prioridade que permeia toda a empresa. Nesse sentido, me lembra um pouco o que se passou há 20 anos, quando ainda havia nas empresas um departamento de inovação. Logo se percebeu que sem inovação no DNA de todo o time, as empresas ficariam para trás. Isso não podia ficar preso a uma caixinha. O mesmo pode-se dizer hoje sobre uma companhia que não pratica genuína e horizontalmente esses valores de governança e responsabilidade socioambiental. Exige-se por todos os lados um propósito das empresas que não se restrinja tão somente ao lucro, mas na mesma dimensão gerar impactos positivos na sociedade. Nós, no Valor, temos aprimorado cada vez mais nossa cobertura nesse sentido. E mais importante do que apontar o que não funciona, ou às vezes é superestimado, para usar um eufemismo, é dar destaque para as iniciativas bem-sucedidas, disseminando experiências e aprendizados. Trata-se de uma transformação estrutural e não meramente evolutiva, um movimento que exige dedicação, disciplina e investimentos relevantes. Será que todos os stakeholders têm a dimensão exata desse esforço e estão dispostos a assumi-lo integralmente? E as métricas do que é feito? Estão ou caminham para uma padronização que se permita medi-los concretamente ou comparar resultados? O que dizer das pequenas e médias empresas, cujas estruturas para esse tipo de transformação são pequenas ou, por vezes, inexistentes, mas que empregam a grande parte do contingente da população economicamente ativa? Como fazer esse movimento contagiar essa turma? Enfim, eu realmente espero que cheguemos ao final dessa manhã com muita informação e inspiração para essas questões. E que vocês, líderes, saiam dessa quinta edição do Cidadão Global mais preparados ainda para acelerar a transformação em suas empresas. O caminho é longo, quase metade das empresas de capital aberto na B3 não divulgam um relatório integrado de atividades ESG. Nós, na Globo, lançamos nesse ano, na nossa jornada ESG, a publicação do nosso primeiro relatório alinhados às diretrizes do GRI, incluindo metas e métricas até 2030. Além disso, mulheres, para ficar somente num exemplo, ainda estão num patamar muito baixo de representatividade nos conselhos de administração das empresas de capital aberto no país, quando a gente compara com indicadores da OCDE. Enfim, acho que temos uma pauta muito interessante e abrangente hoje. Não posso me despedir sem fazer alguns agradecimentos importantes, a começar pela Patrícia Ellen, sócia da Systemiq e fundadora da AIA Initiative, ao Carlo Pereira, CEO do Pacto Global no Brasil, do qual somos, pela Globo, orgulhosamente associados, por todo o apoio que vocês nos deram para que conseguíssemos trazer os painelistas hoje. Faço também um agradecimento especial à Sanda Ojiambo e ao Jeremy Oppenheim, que estão aqui presentes hoje, Paul Polman, que entrará por vídeo, e, por último, a todos vocês, por estarem aqui presentes, aos que estão assistindo a nossa transmissão ao vivo. Eu espero realmente que todo o esmero que a gente trabalhou nos últimos meses para produzir o evento de hoje atenda às expectativas de vocês no final dessa manhã. Muito obrigado.
Fred, muito obrigado pelas palavras. E, pessoal, dando seguimento aqui com a abertura do evento, eu queria chamar ao palco o Mário Leão, que é CEO do Santander Brasil, para nos dar um panorama do cenário ESG no mercado brasileiro e falar um pouco sobre a atuação do setor financeiro na transição para uma economia verde. Por favor, Mário.
Bom dia a todas e todos. Um prazer receber vocês aqui na nossa casa, no Teatro Santander, em mais uma edição, de novo presencial, do nosso Cidadão Global. Nossos parceiros, o Valor Econômico e da Editora Globo como um todo, representados aqui pelo Fred, nosso amigo, e também os nossos palestrantes, que vieram aqui presencialmente, Sanda Ojiambo, Jeremy Oppenheimer e o Paul Polman por vídeo. Vivemos um momento absolutamente único. pela relevância dada às questões climáticas cada vez mais presentes na sociedade como um todo, que refletem no maior engajamento, finalmente, da sociedade civil, que entendeu a criticidade do tema. Todos aqui concluímos que precisamos de soluções práticas e escaláveis agora para zerar as emissões líquidas de carbono. Mas impulsionar a mitigação das mudanças climáticas não é trivial. É preciso levar em conta todos os diferentes níveis de maturidade entre as regulamentações, os setores econômicos, além, claro, das pressões sociais, impulsionadas por inflação, crises energéticas, de abastecimento e, por que não, infelizmente, pela guerra na Europa que a gente vive hoje. Como conciliar tantas urgências? Bom, o mais importante, claro, é agir. E, nesse sentido, direcionar com sabedoria os fluxos de capitais, entre tantas outras coisas, vai ser decisivo para o nosso sucesso. É para isso que a gente está aqui hoje. E nós, no Santander, como na Globo, mantemos o otimismo. É cada vez mais claro que as companhias estão se movimentando. Um estudo recente da Climate Initiative avaliou que 159 empresas globais, 75% delas já encamparam as ambições de emissões líquidas até 2050, inclusive o Santander. Mais importante aqui, estamos vendo um momento relevante de compromissos públicos também intermediários. Não basta falar de 2050 sem falar do que acontece até lá. Para atingir essa meta, precisamos começar a agir muito antes do fim do prazo. Na verdade, aqui no Santander, estamos trabalhando há mais de 20 anos, muito antes da sigla ESG ter sido cunhada pela Sanda, e a partir de agora, desde 2021, quando como Grupo Santander nos juntamos ao Net Zero Banking Alliance, nos comprometendo formalmente a atingir o Net Zero não só do Santander, mas de toda a cadeia, ou todas as cadeias que o Santander financia até 2050. No sistema financeiro, temos todos um papel fundamental, e temos falado como o FEBRABAN, nos diferentes grupos, o próprio Plano Amazônia, cada vez mais sobre isso. Nos relacionamos diretamente com todas as cadeias produtivas que financiamos, e podemos e vamos apoiar nossos clientes na transição para a economia de baixo carbono. Para isso, temos que antes aprender, e nada melhor do que aprender na prática. Temos na nossa tesouraria uma mesa de energia especializada em energia renovável. Estamos criando uma mesa de negociação de carbono para podermos ser um dos grandes atores na negociação de carbono, não só dentro do Brasil, como no mundo. Também somos um dos maiores operadores de CBIOs, que são títulos de descarbonização associados aos biocombustíveis e à distribuição. E todas essas são frentes que nos permitem buscar soluções aplicáveis e também replicáveis para os nossos clientes. Queremos praticar no Santander e, com o nosso exemplo, com a nossa experiência, poder impactar todas as cadeias que a gente influencia como setor bancário. Aqui também cito a Way Carbon, que é uma das maiores consultorias especializadas em transição energética, transição climática no mundo, além do Brasil, claro, que desde o começo do ano passa a fazer parte do Grupo Santander, e ela vai ser uma peça-chave na nossa própria estratégia de descarbonização e no apoio que queremos dar para todos os nossos clientes nos diferentes setores em que atuamos. É a partir do olhar dos clientes e dos setores nos quais estamos inseridos que a gente vai aprender e poder fazer melhor para todos os outros. Aqui cito também algumas tendências que a gente já identificou e que demandam ação imediata do setor financeiro e, claro, do Santander. Agricultura regenerativa, que tem como princípio produzir e, ao mesmo tempo, dar à natureza condições de se recuperar. O emprego de técnicas de manejo da produção, além do uso de bioinsumos, que são materiais orgânicos que usam micro-organismos para tornar os solos mais férteis e combater pragas e doenças. O desenvolvimento de técnicas mais modernas de mensuração, que aumenta a precisão no cálculo do balanço de emissões. O uso crescente de energias renováveis, claro, como a eólica, a fotovoltaica e também os biocombustíveis. E, por fim, ações compensatórias que vão muito além do mercado de carbono. Aqui temos um exemplo recente da Biomas, uma empresa de reflorestamento que surge da nossa união de esforços recente com Suzano, Vale, Itaú, Marfrig e Rabobank, de novo os bancos se unindo em prol de uma agenda comum, em torno de um projeto pioneiro de restauração, conservação e preservação florestal. Na Biomas, a nossa meta é restaurar 2 milhões de hectares e conservar e preservar outros 2 milhões de hectares. É bastante restauração. Com esse exemplo, eu deixo a mensagem de que a mudança que esperamos não será entregue de maneira isolada por um indivíduo, por uma empresa ou por um governo. A cooperação vai ser determinante para a construção de uma economia verde. E é por isso que estamos aqui hoje, nesse quinto Cidadão Global. Porque o caminho longo que leva do discurso à prática deve ser trilhado de mãos dadas por cada um de nós. Espero que vocês tenham um evento super rico e proveitoso. Obrigado por estarem aqui na nossa casa mais uma vez. Um ótimo evento. Bom dia.
Mário, muito obrigado pelas suas palavras e excelente introdução para a nossa pauta de hoje. Nós vamos abrir os trabalhos agora com a participação de um grande líder empresarial e ativista com quem eu tive o prazer de conversar na última semana. Ele é um dos principais defensores de que os negócios devem ser uma força para o bem, acelerando ações no enfrentamento das mudanças climáticas e desigualdades. É dele a frase: o preço de não fazer nada é maior do que o custo de agir. Eu pedi ao nosso convidado que nos desse a sua visão sobre a agenda de sustentabilidade no Brasil, sobre como podemos atrair mais capital sustentável e qual o papel do setor privado no cumprimento da Agenda 2030. Além disso, eu perguntei a ele como as empresas podem ajudar o país a lidar com os atuais desafios ambientais e sociais. Esses são, a meu ver, tópicos imprescindíveis para o nosso encontro de hoje. Senhoras e senhores, com vocês, Paul Polman.
Well, hello everybody. I'm Paul Polman, the former CEO of Unilever and the author of a new book called Net Positive: How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take. First of all, thank you, Ronaldo, for organizing Cidadão Global in São Paulo. And also thanks to Valor, Econômico and Santander for promoting this high-level debate. The change in government in Brazil could not have come at a more important moment, provided we actually capitalize on it. We just came back from the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, and may I say the outcome was outright disappointing. 3 decades of negotiations and still no agreement to reduce the emission of fossil fuel. We cannot be pleased about that. Whilst we know we need to reduce our emissions by 45 to 50% this decade, we're still projecting right now an increase of 12%. Clearly, the current mechanism of negotiating is not working. As I argue in a recent article in Fortune, the non-state actors now need to step up and help de-risk the political process. The private sector has an increasingly important role to play. And for good reason. We see on a daily basis the enormous cost we are already incurring as a result of climate change and the destruction of biodiversity. Think about the 31 million people in Pakistan being displaced, over 18 million people who have lost their lives to COVID, or the hundreds of millions more that are suffering from a lack of food as a result of climate change or rising prices. Some reports, in fact, have predicted that if we don't do anything, by 2070, we could have 1 to 3 billion people more that are forced to flee their homes. Deloitte, in fact, estimates that if we stay on business as usual, projecting to 3 degrees warming or more, that by 2070, we will actually incur additional costs of over $178 trillion. If, however, we take action individually and collectively and do everything possible to stay around the 1.5 degrees science tells us is needed, and by the way, is still within our reach, we would have an economic benefit of $43 trillion. In other words, we're at a moment in humanity where the cost of not acting is becoming higher than the cost of acting. And this makes it such an attractive business opportunity for all of us. I think actually that Brazil has the opportunity to become the first economy to achieve net zero, whilst at the same time boosting its economic growth. Without any doubt, what gives us hope is that Brazil is back. The last great world power that was missing. But it is now imperative that we put words into actions. And there were some encouraging signs. We saw the creation of the United Nations Multi-Donor Fund for the sustainable development of the legal Amazon, in partnership with a consortium of governors of the legal Amazon. We also saw a new large-scale reforestation and preservation alliance of 6 companies committed to restore over 4 million hectares in Brazil over the next 20 years. And we saw the signing of a rainforest protection pact by Brazil, Indonesia, and the Congo, collectively home to over 50% of the world's rainforest that is. And finally, we were encouraged by President Lulu's presence at the COP, but also his intent to host the COP30 in 2025 in the Amazon region in Brazil. No doubt that we now need the private sector in Brazil to step up. Technically, feasible pathways have been paved, even for the hard-to-abate sectors, to reach net zero by 2050. Companies, therefore, must and can certainly set the science-based targets to create robust action plans to achieve these targets of net zero. To date, unfortunately, less than 50 Brazilian companies have set science-based targets, compared to 4,000 companies on a global scope. Acting fast now makes good business sense. Study after study has shown that if major emitting countries like Brazil or Indonesia decarbonize, it also helps their economy and their growth of jobs. In Brazil, nature-based, climate-positive, and people-centric economies could actually deliver between 100 and 150 billion a year of additional GDP for this country by 2030. I'm convinced also that the next 1,000 unicorns won't be search engines or social media companies, but they'll be sustainable, scalable innovations, startups that help the world decarbonize and make the energy transition both affordable and accessible for all citizens. Now, the COVID pause has shown us that we can't have healthy people on an unhealthy planet. It's also shown us that we can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And you would agree with me that anything you can do forever is by definition unsustainable. Fortunately, most people in this world don't want to go back to where we came from. It wasn't working before either. And the good thing is, we are moving in the right directions. More countries than ever signing up to the Paris Agreement. In fact, 95% of global emissions is now covered. More companies setting science-based targets. In fact, 1/4 of all the major companies in the world are already doing that. The financial market starting to move. 60% of the world's assets under management, or over $70 trillion, are now committed to setting net zero emission targets for their portfolios. And last but not least, employees and society at large are demanding and engaging to drive these changes. We have the roadmap. It's called the Sustainable Development Goals. We definitely have the financial and economic arguments, as I pointed out. We also have the technology for most of it. What we now need simply is willpower. Yes, without any doubt, this transition is incredibly complex and requires tough choices, especially as the time frame that we have is limited. It does require heavy investments up front. And it won't be easy. Otherwise, someone else would have done it already before us. But it is more needed than ever. CEOs are struggling to accelerate their climate ambitions, even though 73% say they feel an enormous pressure to act. Many less are actually acting. And this is exactly why we wrote the book Net Positive, How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take. We're asking ourselves some very simple questions in the book. How can you profit from solving the world's problems, not creating them? And frankly, is the world truly better off because your company is in it? First of all, we need to reframe what good looks like. Most companies in this world, in fact 95%, in some way or another write sustainability reports, but they're basically in the CSR mode of being less bad, a little bit less plastics in the ocean, less deforestation in my value chain, or less carbon emission. But when we've overshot these planetary boundaries to the extent we have, the only thing that counts is companies to think regenerative, restorative, reparative. And that is what we call net positive. Net positive companies have some characteristics that we all should strive for. First, they take ownership of their total impact and consequences in this world, intended or not. Many companies still think they can outsource their value chain and also outsource their responsibilities. That simply doesn't work anymore. Net positive companies create positive return for all of their stakeholders. In fact, they drive shareholder value as a result, not as a myopic goal. They work for the long-term benefit, first and foremost, of business and society. And yes, they forge these broader systems changes that the world is needing right now. Now, what does this mean for Brazil, a country rich in natural capital? I think the opportunities for the private sector are frankly enormous. First of all, to scale nature-based solutions. The most cost-effective method of capturing and storing greenhouse gases. And Brazil, with 2/3 of its emissions coming from deforestation, has a tremendous opportunity. Also, to transform the way we produce food and not only stop deforestation, but also convert to sustainable agriculture. We also need to decarbonize the industries. With just over 50 companies having committed science-based targets versus 4,000 in the rest of the world, we have a tremendous opportunity. And as I said, even in the hard to abate, the high emitting sectors, we now have companies in the world that are making the net zero commitments. It is possible. We need to also attract capital and de-risk investments. Obviously, halting deforestation, for example, is a key way to attract the capital from abroad. But at the end of the day, we can't do it alone. More than ever do we need the broader collaborations. Brazil can be a big part of the solution and should get out of being a big part of the problem. CEO leadership, for that reason, is fundamental. The leaders also need to create these broader coalitions between the private sector, government, non-profits, and academia to attack these tougher challenges that we're talking about. Now, some of the efforts are already happening, and hopefully with the potential to be at scale. Think about the Energy Transition Commission work, or the Blended Finance Task Force, or the Food and Land Use Coalitions. All initiatives meant to accelerate our transformation and to drive the systems change needed. This, I believe, is also the moment for the Global South to position itself as a systems actor and rule changer, rather than simply responding to existing power and market structures. In fact, to ensure climate justice, the Global South must be a leading voice in the definition of international standards, financial mechanisms, and governance to support the transition to a human prosperity empowered by nature. I'm glad to see that Systemiq helped design and act as secretariat of these 4 major global coalitions. It is especially encouraging to see the work established by AYA Earth Partners. AYA could become the first global coalition, in my opinion, based in the Global South. Headquartered in São Paulo and coordinated by Patricia Allen and Alexander Allar. The first coalition in the Global South dedicated to positioning Brazil at the center of solutions in the transition to a global low-carbon economy, focusing on nature-positive solutions, mobilizing the financial and human capital needed to transform Brazil into the first major net positive nation by 2030, attracting investments and promoting dialogue on decarbonization and the value of standing forests. Above all this will require a human transformation, a strong willpower. A company can only move towards net positive if its leaders are courageous enough to challenge business as usual, to put the interest of their own behind the interest of the common good. Undoubtedly, you'll get pushback in this transition, but the price to go for makes it worth it. In many places, people say that the real crisis is not climate change or inequality or food insecurity. These are basically the symptoms. The real crisis, I believe, is a crisis of leadership, of greed, of selfishness, of apathy. Business needs to move to a competitive leadership, away from business needs to move, to a collaborative leadership, away from competitive leadership. Business needs to set courageous goals. Business needs to form these transformative partnerships. Especially in countries as important as Brazil, at the very center of the solution in the transition to a global low-carbon economy. Setting the bar higher, changing systems, working with your competitors and governments. These are immensely demanding, but also rewarding challenges. Ultimately, we can get there if we reframe what good looks like, transforming ourselves, our companies, and society through transformative partnerships with humanity at the center. I want to thank you for all you're doing and wishing you successful meetings. And let me end with a quote from Wangari Maathai, who was a Nobel Prize winner from Africa, who said it very well when she said that in the course of history, there comes a time when humanity is called upon to shift to a new level of consciousness, to reach a higher moral ground. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that time is now. Thank you very much.
Pessoal, sempre muito bom ouvir o Polman. Eu tive a oportunidade de jantar com ele em Londres um pouquinho antes da pandemia e ele é uma daquelas pessoas que são unanimidade, né? Que todo mundo quer ouvir. Ele construiu uma reputação imensa com ações concretas, né, no board das empresas em que ele trabalhou. E o Cidadão Global é um evento que tradicionalmente recebe grandes personalidades internacionais. A gente já teve aqui o ex-presidente dos Estados Unidos, Barack Obama, o historiador Yuval Harari, que eu tive até a oportunidade de entrevistar, a Viola Davis e o ambientalista Al Gore. E essa edição aqui, ela não podia ser diferente. Então, queria que todo mundo se preparasse agora para receber dois dos maiores experts quando o assunto é clima e sustentabilidade. Em suas palestras, eles vão trazer muita inspiração e estratégias para as transformações de ESG. Na sequência, a gente vai participar de um breve talk show, comigo inclusive, e com a nossa convidada especial. A primeira convidada, aliás, a ocupar o palco aqui, é um dos principais nomes do Pacto Global, instituição que criou o termo ESG. Ela é Sanda Ojiambo, ela é assistente do secretário-geral e CEO do Pacto Global da ONU, líder da maior iniciativa de sustentabilidade corporativa do mundo e a principal responsável pela relação com o setor privado nas Nações Unidas. Olha, não poderia estar mais honrado aqui do que receber a Sanda. Sanda, welcome very much. Thanks for being with us.
Bom dia. Business leaders, colleagues, distinguished guests, it's such a pleasure to be with you here today in Sao Paulo, my first visit to Brazil as well. I'd like to thank Global Group for your commitment to this important dialogue and for inviting me. I'd also like to thank Global Compact Network in Brazil for your ongoing efforts to advance sustainable business nationwide. As you all know, the corporate sustainability landscape is fast changing. Recently, discussions have focused on issues such as the role of business in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and the relevance and the robustness of the ESG, the environmental, social, and governance framework. And importantly, to many of you here in the room, the role of business leaders in driving forward societal transformation. We may debate specific issues, but now more than ever, I think we can all agree that the business community is a necessary and very valued contributor to contributor to national development plans and the global sustainable development goals. In my comments today, I would like to address the urgency of harnessing the full potential of business to get the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development back on track. And I would like to also focus on the most effective methods for long-term sustainability, including committing to making measurable targets and unlocking sustainable finance. But first, I'd like to kick off with a discussion on some reflections on our journey so far. The Global Compact was formed in the year 2000 against the backdrop of big capital, recession, rising inequalities, and the genuine desire of a number of enlightened businesses and business leaders to play a role in addressing the world's most challenging and intractable issues. From the very beginning, a range of Brazilian companies stepped forward to join in our ranks. These early joiners included, for example, Natura Cosméticos, CPFL Energia, and Klabin. Later in the year 2004, when the UN Global Compact coined the concept of environmental, social, and governance framework for businesses, or rather the ESG framework, we knew that companies could increase their competitiveness and value for shareholders by committing to sustainable business practices. Almost 20 years later, ESG is more relevant than ever for businesses. And studies show that ESG strategies can affect operating profits by as much as 60%, according to McKinsey. Globally, ESG investments will likely be worth $41 trillion by the end of this year. And in Brazil, in 2021, 80% of managers cited ESG investment policies, up from 69% in 2018. ESG is no longer considered a niche or unique business strategy. In fact, aligning business practices with ESG, along with other frameworks that encourage responsible business practices, has become synonymous with doing good and profitable businesses. But of course, there's critics, and critics of ESG point out that while businesses and markets are benefiting from this ESG label, their ESG commitments are falling far short of the positive change that the world needs. So, ladies and gentlemen, this discussion here today comes at a very critical time. As we gather here, we know that the world is facing economic instability, food and energy crises, escalating conflicts, and worsening impact of climate and climate change. Taking stock of our progress on the Sustainable Development Goals shows that the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is in grave and serious danger. Public and private sectors alike are struggling to deal with the interconnected global crises. The fallout from the war in Ukraine, amongst many other wars that are ongoing in the world, has sent shockwaves, economic shockwaves around the world. And in Brazil, we know that the war has impacted agribusiness as Russia, a major source of fertilizer, abruptly imposed sanctions. Pollution and severe weather events are also threatening communities and ecosystems worldwide. But as home to the most of the Amazon rainforest, these threats take on an added urgency for Brazil. Climate-related pressures on businesses and supply chains often lead to unsustainable practices that in a vicious circle further threaten the natural environment. You all know this better than I do. Meanwhile, the window to limit global warming to our 1.5-degree goal is quickly closing. And current national commitments and actions are falling far short of necessary reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Brazil, however, has a very robust and growing renewable energy sector. representing 50% of the overall energy market. But there's still so much more to be done. So, ladies and gentlemen, these ongoing global crises have taught us that businesses cannot act independently of their environments. And as Paul Polman, who you just heard, discusses in his Net Positive Manifesto, companies must play a more active role in addressing local and global crises for practical as well as moral reasons. After all, as Paul reminds us, businesses cannot thrive unless the people and the planet are also thriving. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals offer a principles-based framework for businesses to assess their impact on local and global development challenges. The goals also serve as a true North Star to guide enterprises, since we know that continuous change is the only truly constant factor in the business world. But it surely is time to acknowledge that business actions do not match the pace and the ambition needed to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. The business community can and must do better. The good news is that there's lots of tools and guidance that exist to help companies bridge the gap between sustainability ambitions and concrete actions, and I'll talk about a few of them. At this point, I'd like to discuss how, by committing to setting measurable targets, companies can increase sustainability across a wide range of issues, from climate change to labor and to other rights. First of all, measurable targets are good business, the same way one may have commercial targets. The public is increasingly becoming aware of exaggerated ESG claims. In fact, in Europe, for example, regulators have struck off over 1,000 European funds from the sustainability universe after imposing a stricter set of rules to define what can be labeled a sustainable fund. And as the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative, with more than 17,000 active businesses and participants in over 161 countries, the UN Global Compact prioritizes accountability and credibility. We know that for businesses to contribute to sustainable development, they must adopt a holistic, principle-based approach across all of their operations. All of our participants, for example, commit to uphold our 10 principles on human rights, labor, the environment, and anti-corruption. This commitment is a measurable one. The UN Global Compact has recently updated our annual reporting framework, or the communication on progress, as we call it, which we will roll out afresh in the new year. This framework allows participants to measure and demonstrate progress on the 10 principles and the Sustainable Development Goals, and it holds them accountable to improving year after year. The UN Global Compact also helps multi-stakeholder partnerships to increase accountability and ensure collective impact towards viable solutions. In our interconnected world, there is an increasing demand of these types of collaborations. Just last month, for example, when I was in Egypt at COP27, as Paul also spoke about, I heard a clear call for the business community to increase accountability in addressing the climate crisis. This includes, for example, committing to transparent and measurable targets. As investors and other stakeholders demand reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from business, we have seen widespread greenwashing. That is, when companies paint a picture that is perhaps more rosier of sustainability without consistent or measurable results. To combat greenwashing, the UN Secretary-General at COP launched a technical experts report, which was aptly titled, Integrity Matters. This report calls on all non-state actors, private sector actors like yourselves, to hold their net zero commitments to the highest possible standards of credibility. The Science-Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI, for which the UN Global Compact is a founding partner, has highlighted this in this report as a credible standard for credible net zero targets from companies. An example of how powerful transparent and measurable targets can be, between 2015 and 2020, companies with approved targets through SBTI reduced emissions by 29%, exceeding global trends. Companies with committed and validated targets through SBTi now cover more than a third of the global economy, with $38 trillion in market capitalization. In Brazil alone, 49 companies have committed to the SBTi. 49, but we need many more. Not only will these companies invest in green energy to meet their own targets, but they will also set the global scale by participating in this global message and sending a clear message to the market. Brazil, with its clean energy matrix and bioeconomic possibilities, has the potential to be a global leader in the clean energy revolution. With access to a huge wealth of renewable energy resources, Brazil's capacity to generate renewable energy is significantly higher than the global average. And as one of the most biodiverse countries on Earth, Brazil has a unique and powerful voice in the global climate dialogue. Another clear message that came from COP27 is that as businesses compete to advance sustainable economies, they must ensure that the transition is a just and inclusive one. Whether we're talking about climate, energy, food systems, or digital transitions, people and their livelihoods must be the central concern. This means that there's so much more to do to ensure that these transitions are designed and implemented and governed appropriately. Careful consideration must be given to skilling, work opportunities, living wages, gender equity, and building inclusive societies. But to achieve this type of just transition, we must have industry-specific targets developed by a diverse range of stakeholders. Recently at COP again, the Global Compact announced some initial findings from our work in one sector, the global maritime or shipping sector, where 800,000 seafarers need to be upskilled to meet shipping's decarbonization goals by mid-2030. I was thrilled to help the Maritime Just Transition Task Force launch an action plan developed by the UN Global Compact in partnership with other stakeholders, UN organizations, ship owners, and the Seafarers Union. The plan includes targets protecting jobs for employees, as well as reducing industrial emissions. With some of the highest volume of ports in Latin America, the shipping industry is indeed a critical sector for the Brazilian economy. National efforts to decarbonize Brazil's maritime industry and achieve a just and people-centered transition have the potential to positively impact not only Brazil, but the entire region. So ladies and gentlemen, finally, we know that we will never achieve the Sustainable Development Goals without private sector investments and the mobilization of financial markets for this. We believe that there's ample capital in the world to provide the $5 to $7 trillion that is needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. However, much of that wealth lies in stranded assets or investments that do not advance the Sustainable Development Goals. So at the same time, the global financial architecture is such that countries that are most in need of this important financing are unable to access this funding from multilateral development banks or international financial institutions. Herein truly lies the opportunity to leverage private financing. With more than $17 trillion in annual investments in capital expenditures, research and development, and talent and marketing, private corporations are key levers in the sustainability transition of the global economy. At the UN Global Compact, through our Chief Financial Officer Coalition for the Sustainable Development Goals, we aim to create a $10 trillion market for SDG-linked financial portfolio by the year 2030. Corporations will compete for capital based on the ambition and the credibility of their targets and performance that is linked and related to the SDGs. We have been working alongside financial institutions and UN partners and other key stakeholders to advance financial innovation, including SDG-linked bonds, as well as others. So ladies and gentlemen, the challenges before us may seem daunting, but the good news is that businesses have managed to make progress on sustainability, not even in the face of these crises, but just not enough progress. The UN Global Compact local network here in Brazil, I'm proud to say, is one of the fastest growing networks in the world. Since its launch in the year 2003, the network has mobilized high-level private sector leadership and offered local business training and support. Allow me to thank Carlo for his incredible leadership of the local network here in Brazil. Its Ambition 2030 strategy, which aims to accelerate the delivery of key SDGs, already has more than 244 businesses and business commitments. I'm also excited about the 8 SDG-focused movement that Pacto Global has recently launched. I'm excited to share some insights from Brazil from the latest edition of the UN Global Compact CEO study, which will be released very soon. Actually, it'll be released in Davos next year, so just next month. For CEOs in Brazil, 93% believe that the SDGs can be achieved. However, only 55% feel that business is already playing a critical role in terms of delivering on those SDGs. Only 37% feel that businesses could play a critical role in the achievement with an increased commitment and action. So the work before us is clear. There is a clear opportunity gap that we can work on closing together in order to scale Brazil's private sector support and commitment and action for the SDGs. So my dear friends, I've been truly encouraged to witness the growing level of engagement of Brazilian businesses in the work that goes on within the Global Compact and the sustainability community. The issues that I've addressed here today, responsible business, credible commitments, accountability, transparency, and strategic implementation of the ESG and Sustainable Development Frameworks are top of our agenda at the UN Global Compact. Together with over 60 local networks around the world, including the local network here in Brazil, we work with 17,000 companies worldwide of all sizes to shape their corporate strategies through a sustainability lens, to integrate the SDGs, and to drive responsible business forward. I welcome all of you present to join us as we work together towards a more just and resilient society in Brazil and certainly worldwide. I thank you all very much for your kind attention.
Muito obrigado, Sanda. Sempre muito inspirador te ouvir. Pessoal, agora eu tenho a honra de anunciar o economista e cofundador da Systemiq, que é uma B Corporation dedicada a acelerar a entrega do Acordo de Paris e dos Objetivos de Desenvolvimento Sustentável da ONU, transformando mercados, modelos de negócio e classes de ativos em 3 sistemas econômicos: uso da terra, natureza, energia limpa e materiais. Eu estou falando do Jeremy Oppenheim, que é referência em vários conselhos de organizações sem fins lucrativos, como o Global Action Plan e o Woods Hole Research Center. Ele é o principal autor do relatório Better Growth, Better Climate, do projeto New Climate Economy. Por favor, Jeremy, please join me here in the stage. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Brazil. It's wonderful to be here. I want to start just by thanking Valor, by thanking Santander, by thanking Globo. Ronaldo, thank you so much for the warm and generous introduction. It's really great to be here. It's a little bit daunting to be here. First of all, I can't see anybody. I guess that's the way these things work. I'm conscious of the people in previous years who've had this slot. I also know that following Paul and Sanda, I'm kind of standing on the shoulders of giants in this field. So it's a real honor to be here with you. The purpose of this presentation is very simple. And it is to share with you not just the challenge that we face, but also the opportunity to take this challenge and make this Brazil's moment, to truly make this Brazil's moment as we reshape the global economy. Because one way or another, that's what's going to happen over the next 20, 30 years. And we have a choice about whether we reshape it in a way that builds a better economy for everybody and a better society, or whether we fail to seize this moment. So let me take you through a story which I hope persuades everybody here not only that we should make the positive change, but that we can and that we must. Let me start with just a sense of where we're at. And I'm going to focus on the climate story. I could make a story about nature that would be the same. I could honestly make a story about the social inequalities that we face in the world, but also here in Brazil. Here's the climate story, and it's very simple, which is that over the last, essentially, 50 years, we've gone from quite a bit of space in terms of climate and the atmosphere to filling it up. And you can see the picture unfolding. What happens over time is suddenly we get to the 1980s, 1990s, and it accelerates. We emit more and more greenhouse gases in the world, and we get to what is now a climate tipping point. The scientists tell us that within the next 5 years, there is a 50% chance that we will break through 1.5 degrees of global warming, right? That should be absolutely terrifying to everybody sitting here. We shouldn't sit here, we should stand up and then get on and do something. But the good news in all of this is that if we're honest with ourselves, the story of how we advance in the world is that we wait and we wait and we wait until we can wait no more. And then at the last possible moment, the truth is that we're quite good at taking action. So this presentation, and what I hope we walk away with today, is that now is the moment to take the action. And we can't wait any longer. So what we need to do is we need transformative change at speed and scale. And it's pretty straightforward, and I'm going to just hold you on this thought for a moment as we see some of the pictures. There is no future energy system in the world that is a high carbon, highly wasteful energy system. We can't afford it. There is no food system in the world that continues to destroy nature at vast, unprecedented scale. It doesn't exist. There is no company that I work with across the world that in either the energy sector or the food sector or some of the industrial sectors that's betting on a future that is about being more wasteful, being more carbon intensive, being more destructive. That is not the future. So the question is, how do we seize a future that is the one that we really want? And how do we do it at speed and scale? Now, Brazil is, along with other countries in the global south, has an extraordinary opportunity. It's an opportunity that's been, in a sense, in Brazil's hands for many decades, but timing is everything in life. My daughter does stand-up comedy, which is extraordinary, given her father. And she tells me that timing is everything in the jokes that she tells. So the timing is now for Brazil and other countries in the global south to seize on this shift in the global economy. What you see here is some basic numbers, right? That you'll see numbers all over this climate debate, day in, day out. They're all slightly different from each other, but these are the numbers which say, in terms of tackling that immense challenge of the greenhouse gas emissions filling up the atmosphere with, if you will, greenhouse gases, there is no pathway. There is no pathway to net zero that does not include a dramatic shift in the approach to land use. And with that shift, what one has is the opportunity to create huge, if you will, nature-based assets and nature-based solutions, which both, if you will, transform how we think about food and agricultural production, but also transform and create opportunities around nature-based carbon markets and the assets that sit within, if you will, the forests and the extraordinary biomes in the global south, of which Brazil has the biggest. So if the world is going to tackle the challenge we have, in the north we're going to have to start paying differently, right? Let's be clear, this doesn't happen just because the South decides that it's going to step up to the challenge. The North has to do a big part of the work, but the South has an opportunity sitting in its hands. This is, just to make sure I get this is the way in which the use of nature, the use of the huge land assets that sit within the global South really breaks down. This is not a theoretical debate, right? There are, first of all, specific strategies that lead us to understand how we can deliver gigatons of improvement in the way in which we manage land and cut back on greenhouse gas emissions and then draw down carbon from the atmosphere. So we have approaches that link protecting the forests we have, shifting how we use land, and then actually restoring that land at great scale. So we kind of know what to do. This is not something which is just about imagination, and nor is it something that's never been done before. There are countries in the South and in the North that are making real strides on reshaping their approach to using their natural assets, and where Brazil, in part, is already taking some of the steps that will be needed, but not with the speed and the scale that the opportunity deserves. If you look at I'll get this to work. If you look at the economic model that we've seen supporting growth over the last 30, 40 years, what you'll see is an economic model in which countries such as China have grown dramatically, right? And they've used resources. They have in particular used energy in a hugely, if you will, wasteful way. And they've driven their own economic growth. That model, which China followed, and which a number of countries have followed, but China is the case study, is not a model that is available today. And in truth, it's not a model that Brazil has been successful in following, even over the last 20, 30 years. Brazil itself has actually had much lower rates of growth per capita than a China or a South Korea or a number of other countries. But Brazil, unfortunately, has gone about a slow rate of growth, but in a very resource-intensive and very wasteful way. And that's a combination that is no longer, it was never a particularly attractive combination, as I think all of you in the audience know, but it's certainly not a winning formula for the future. And what I want to just emphasize, if I can get the slides to travel, is that in fact, that model that we've had over the last 25, 30 years of a resource-intensive, wasteful model of economic growth, right, has failed to deliver growth at the level of a China or many of the other Asian economies, but it's also failed to deliver some of the social outcomes that we want to see. And I know that Brazil, as many countries across the world, has been hit by COVID, has been hit by inflation and the impacts of the war in Ukraine. But these results, right, of where Brazil is today, relative to the extraordinary potential of the country, are not where any of us want to be. So forget climate for a moment and forget whether or not Brazil has, if you will, some extraordinary role to play in the world. And let's just focus on what's in Brazil's interests in terms of building an economy that really can deliver for all the people of Brazil. If you look right now, just to make that link back to climate, I wanted to just re-emphasize the fact that actually Brazil's per capita emissions at 8.5, 9 tons per capita are extraordinarily greater today than the per capita emissions of Europe. And yet Brazil has an $8,000 per capita GDP, and Europe is at $40,000. So emitting lots of greenhouse gases doesn't give you, if you will, economic performance. At least in Brazil's case, it's leading to a huge wedge between the economy and the society that I think Brazil has the opportunity to build, and the level of environmental, if you will, waste and destruction that's going on. So what we've been doing, together with our partners at Aya, and wonderfully led by Patricia Ellen, is to develop something called the Amazon's Marathon, putting at the very heart of the, if you will, transformative moment in the Brazilian economy, the chance to take the immense assets that Brazil has and to figure out how to make them to work. How to make them work for Brazil, first and foremost, for the people of Brazil, and then to feed them into the shift in those global markets that is starting. It's not there, but it's starting to play out. What are those assets? And you've heard them before, you've heard them from Paul, you've heard them from Sanda. You all know this, right? You have an extraordinary clean energy matrix. You have at Brazil a standing forest that is the envy of the world and has within it a set of biological resources that will be the gift that keeps on giving, provided that those resources are well managed. You have, unfortunately, in a sense, 80 million hectares of degraded land that could be restored. You have bioenergy assets, a depth of expertise in agribusiness, and a whole set of, if you will, other resources that, combined with the bioeconomy and combined with the clean energy matrix, could be the leading clean energy, clean metal and mineral supply to the world. What needs to happen, of course, is that these will not simply, if you will, become the assets that they could be without real work and without real, if you will, drive and determination and willpower, right, in the private sector and also in the public sector, with policies that actually enable us to unlock the opportunity in front of us. And there's a reality here, which is, and we've laid it out in this Amazon's Marathon, which is that we can combine huge economic upside, $100 to $150 billion, with real opportunities. It has to be about creating good jobs for people across the country, particularly in those parts of the country that are, if you will, starved of those employment opportunities. It's linked to, if you will, a restoration of good land use across the economy. And it's linked to, if you will, Brazil becoming the world's first net zero economy by 2030, not because that's the moral act or because it's a nice thing to do for everybody else, but because it's so deeply grounded in Brazil's economic and social self-interest. And understood properly, it is the moment for Brazil to go from that economy that has used enormous resources over the last 20, 30 years without getting the returns, to one that manages resources much, much more, if you will, effectively, and gets a very different return on those resources. So what does that mean? It means going from the great theory of this to specific practices, individual projects, businesses, and then taking those individual projects, and this is an example up in the Amazon of a project that we've been involved with, working with indigenous communities to develop the Brazil nut supply chain, and doing so in a way that can then take it to scale. And if we just do these little projects on the ground one by one and don't get to scale, we don't change the world. We don't drive the speed and scale of transformation that's needed. And this is why we're describing here in the Amazon's Marathon report, the way of going from individual projects to that scale of a green belt, or to the scale of Brazil leading the world in sustainable agricultural commodities, or in clean metals and mining. This is the moment for that scale up to start, to really start. Let me just finish on a couple of notes. One is to reinforce what Paul said, which is that this change in the world, this change in how Brazil seizes its moment, right, is not just going to happen if we take a business as usual mindset. It never does, right? This is an adventure, right? One of the best adventures. I am so excited about the future here, not just for those of us in the audience, but for your children as well, because actually if we start leading and collaborating in a different way on finance, through bringing public and private finance together, on the energy system, capitalizing on that clean matrix, on the industrial sectors, building off the back of the huge hydrogen potential in this economy. You could be an absolute world leader. And then through, of course in Brazil, back into food and land use and taking the superpowers of this economy and really making them not just deliver commodities, but differentiated high-value products that are the ones that the, if you will, the high-value customers really want. That means coming together, working on system change, collaborating as leaders to build better economic systems for a better Brazil. So that's my message to you, right? This is a really perilous moment. We are closing in on 1.5 degrees of global warming, and that will have all sorts of consequences for vulnerable communities across your country. But because we're so close to the edge, it actually is the reason why, in truth, given who we are as humans, we might actually get our act together. And with, if you will, the talent and capability and resources. Someone said to me as I was preparing for this speech, you know, Brazil never does anything in a linear way. We're not going to do this as a straight line, Jeremy. We're going to do this in our own non-linear, different, agile way. This is the moment for that agility, right? To come together, to break some of the rules about how you've competed and worked with each other in the past, to seize what is clearly an opportunity, to recognize that the cost of acting is not just a cost, it's an opportunity, while the cost of inaction is immense. And what we should do is very simple. We should come forward together and actually change the clock speed. We should do so with an understanding of the scale. This isn't about CSR projects one at a time. This is about scale, right? It is about building things at the system level, and it is about creating opportunity and prosperity for everyone. Thank you so, so much. I am going to, I think, ask the people managing the screen to shift us to a short video for the next 2 or 3 minutes, because it's one thing to have words about all of this and some passion, and you need words and passion and leadership, but it's another to see the picture of what's possible. So let's roll the video for the next 2 or 3 minutes and end up this segment on that basis. Thank you.
Ever since I was a young seedling, Aya's offered her morning light to greet our majestic rainforest. She creeps over the horizon to give us life and limb. I've been standing tall for a century. I've seen my ancestors fall and my dearest seedlings grow. We are a home, a habitat to many, and a resource to some. But over the years, I've seen more and more siblings move in. The first wave celebrated us in song, ceremony, and spirit. Now others burn, buy, and build riches on our backs. They don't see that the riches lie in us standing strong. We are the life force of the earth, and we are disappearing. But there is still hope. A spark that could ignite a new, climate-positive era of your global economy, shifting from the extractive model of the past to a nature-based model of the future. Brazil can increase its GDP by $100 to $150 billion per year by 2030. The Amazon offers the greatest economic opportunity for Brazil and for the rest of the world. 11 unique pathways can lead you there to protect my home and push humanity toward a sustainable era. Establish a green belt to stop deforestation from ravaging my home. Evolve the modern agriculture industry to generate the same output on far less land. Develop new strategies to cut carbon emissions in half this decade. Put resources into technology and businesses that value the untapped potential of the Amazon's unparalleled biodiversity. Create 8 million new green tech jobs by 2030. Uplift and protect our indigenous communities, the guardians of our home and all life on Earth. Almost half the population of the Amazon lives below the poverty line. Empower resilient people striving for prosperity from a nature-positive perspective. Preserve traditional cultures and ancestral wisdom in the face of shrinking indigenous populations. The future is ancestral. Crack down on illegal activity and the networks that sustain it so we can build a green economy. Global wealth continues to rise, but it's increasingly concentrated in the global north. Find ways to bring development to the southern hemisphere. And let's heal a divided world to include the global south in key international decision-making organizations. Global coalitions can help make this happen. Let's build upon this knowledge for our future and the future of all life on Earth. Will you be the stewards you're meant to be, or will Earth be forced to shake you to extinction? This is a dire race to net zero and a race to resilience. What will be the fate of the human race? Join us. Human prosperity empowered by nature.
So thank you all. I hope you got the message, probably better from the video than from me. It's time to change, and it's time to act. Enough words, now to action. Thank you.
Queria agradecer ao Jeremy pela ótima apresentação e também pelo vídeo. E, pessoal, a partir de agora, a gente vai bater um papo sobre os principais pontos que a gente discutiu aqui no encontro, questionar um pouquinho mais os nossos palestrantes e tentar tirar algumas conclusões sobre o que a gente acabou de ouvir e de ver, tá? Então, para me acompanhar nesse debate, eu vou chamar o Jeremy, a Sanda e a nossa convidada especial, em primeiro lugar, a Maite Leite, que é vice-presidente executiva institucional do Santander Brasil. Por favor, junte-se a nós. E Maite, vem aqui.
Aqui, ó.
Opa, que susto! E olhando para cá. Bom, vamos lá, pessoal. Vou mudar aqui, vamos sentar aqui junto com vocês. Deixei, acho que, parte das minhas fichas caírem, então vamos lá. É assim que é bom. Bom, Maite, a palavra é sua.
Bom dia a todos. É um prazer, um privilégio estar aqui hoje. Muito feliz de receber vocês todos. Muito obrigada pela presença. Sanda, Jeremy, I'm completely fascinated by your presentations. Thank you so much. I'm very honored to share the stage with you. It's wonderful to actually meet you both in person, and such a complex effort. You are world leaders, and you are now inspiring us how to really, really change that in our country. So thank you very much.
Pessoal, vamos dar início então à conversa e eu vou pedir licença para a gente continuar em inglês. I'm going to switch to English so that we can all have a fluid conversation, I hope. And just before we start, since we are in Brazil, I would just like to ask you, are you following the World Cup by any means?
Look, I'm staying here tomorrow. I'm going to be at a party tomorrow afternoon. I intend to celebrate through the evening.
All right. I intend to celebrate too, so yes. Do you follow soccer by any means, Sanda?
You know, the only soccer I actually watch is the World Cup. So once every 4 years I watch soccer. And I too will be here tomorrow and looking forward to celebrations.
Excellent, thank you so much.
Come join our
root
party.
for Brazil. Yeah. So Maite, I think you have a question, right, for Jeremy?
For Jeremy.
Yes.
So Jeremy, in the last few years, we have been faced with unprecedented circumstances. As you have just mentioned in your presentation, a pandemic which led to severe breaks in global supply chains, then a war in Ukraine, resulting in a generalized hike in inflation, and now we have protests in China, all of which are compromising our ESG initiatives. How do you see us overcoming these challenges and effectively fulfilling our ESG and global commitments?
So, look, I'm really simple about this. When I look at COVID and the pandemic, what I see is a pandemic that was at least in part triggered by the way we abuse nature. Right? When I look at what has happened with Russia and Ukraine, I see a global crisis that has been triggered in large part by Europe's excessive dependency on Russian natural gas. Right? And here in Brazil, of course, dependency on imported fertilizer, which itself is part of the global supply chain. So you look at the root causes of every one of the shocks that are happening to the global economy, the inflation, which is energy and food, the war in Ukraine, the pandemic, every single one of them has their roots in the failure of our global economy to operate on a regenerative basis and instead to operate on a largely extractive basis. So if we keep on repeating the same old way of doing things and we keep on going for a resource-intensive, overly centralized, wasteful economy that destroys our natural capital and creates, if you will, the concentration of power in countries that have hydrocarbons and fossil fuels, we will just repeat, if you will, all these crises. And society will suffer, and the economy will suffer, and businesses will suffer, and your bank will suffer, because you will take hit after hit after hit. And the only thing that will be different as we go forward is those hits will get systematically bigger. Right? I can't promise you that, but I can guarantee it. Right? That's what will happen if we keep on repeating the mistake. So I would venture that there's an alternative, right? Which is not about keeping to our ESG commitments, but it's accelerating the shift. And I think parts of that are happening. The funny thing is that on the surface, what you see is all these problems, right? And you do, and I understand it, and very short term, I see around the world companies going, oh, can we stick with the ESG story? And, is that, but the companies that will win are the ones that see through that short term and look underneath the surface and see that the tectonic plates are really shifting. And those tectonic plates are ones where there's more clean energy being put into the world today than ever before. Right? There's a shift in the way that we're thinking about global supply chains, and you all know it, right? That means that you don't want to be stuck in a downward spiraling commodity trap. You want to be adding value to the products. So let's get, in a sense, out of the language, if you don't mind, of compliance in ESG and how do we stick with it, and let's get into the language of business, which is about building businesses that are fit for the future and that can seize the next set of opportunities. And if we do that well, if we really do that well, we will give ourselves a chance of actually reducing the risk of the next pandemic and reducing the risk of the next oil shock or natural gas shock that comes out of, if you will, energy-related conflict. Let's change the game.
Thank you.
Excellent. Jeremy, I think you might realize that we have here in the audience people from a very large number of companies in Brazil. And also I'd like to emphasize the importance of startup companies that are involved in the ESG efforts as well. And I think those that are sitting here, they're very interested in learning about what they can do in practical terms, in terms of like transformation, investments, concrete actions, all thinking about the effective implementation of the ESG agenda. Can you talk a little bit about that, taking into account the audience here?
The audience that I can't see, but I'm sure you're out there somewhere. Hi, right? So look, I'm going to push on a reframe, if that's okay. I don't think this is the ESG agenda, right? And I know that in some ways that's language that we all use, and I use it too. So I'm happy to have a debate. I think this is an agenda that is anchored in the future of the, if you will, the sectors in which you're operating. This is a business strategy conversation. It's a deep operational conversation, but it's not the old ESG conversation that we were in, right? Which is, how do we make sure that we tick a few boxes and keep ourselves, if you will, in good health in terms of risk management. This is now a different conversation. We have an energy system in the world, and I know that the matrix is different in Brazil, but we have an energy system which is still 70% based on fossil fuels. Over the next 25 years, even if we don't hit every one of the numbers we need to in, if you will, the goal of meeting net zero, but directionally, the energy system will move from being 70% fossil fuel based. By 2050, it'll be somewhere in the order of 25 or 30% fossil fuel based. Everything else is about investment in a different, better, cleaner, more distributed, smarter and more agile energy system. There are companies across Brazil, right, who are building new business models and new technology and new value chains predicated on that knowledge. And if there's any country that has a head start in this, it's this one, right? I don't know of another country that has as extensive a clean energy matrix, not just on electrons, which is the future of the economy, but also on liquid, if you will, forms of energy, because this is the country that has figured out how to do bioenergy better than any other country in the world. And you've been at it for 25, 30 years, and there are some world-class, outstanding companies that do that. Here in Brazil, anchored in this economy with the best, most innovative, smartest approaches, not just to first or second generation bioenergy, but to third generation. So this is a country which has, in a sense, got this wonderful, wonderful opportunity to combine two things. One is the richest endowment on the planet in terms of natural capital, the richest endowment, so don't blow it, please, right, with a wonderful emerging generation of companies and talent that is digitally capable, right? I mean, I keep on meeting all these companies and people that are so smart about how to use tech. And you know, the joy of this moment is, how do you take nature and natural capital? How do you take technological capital and digital? How do you combine the two and build world-leading companies and value chains? Now, I didn't use the word ESG agenda, right? What I talked about is the future of the economy, right? And that's not just here in Brazil, it's the global markets that Brazil can play into. So that, in my mind, is the opportunity. And I recognize that there are quarters where life is tougher. And I know that banks then go, you know, that finding a way to reallocate capital towards some of these newer value chains and newer business models and newer asset classes is hard when actually some of the banking regulation can get in the way. I get the problem, right? And I've honestly lived with hundreds of companies in the last 25 years going on this journey from, in a sense, an ESG world to a future of our business and how sustainability can drive innovation and operational effectiveness and create huge economic value. And if we are going to succeed, right, my strong conviction is we will only succeed if we can shift that mindset into one about economic value creation at the heart of building a new, better, a much more competitive and productive economy. If we do that, we give ourselves a chance. If we're stuck in ESG compliance land, we will not win.
Yeah, we won't blow it, right? I think it's all about converging. I think we are still in different places. We all need to get to a common place. I think that's where we are. And glad to hear that some of my thoughts made some way to your mind. Sanda, in your role at the United Nations, you have been extremely successful in building partnerships that drive impact and expand the reach of ESG principles. What can you tell Brazilian companies about moving from concept into practice?
Great, thank you. And once again, it's good to be here with the audience. You know, in responding to this, actually, I'll just pick up from where Jeremy left, because as we've said, I mean, the ESG is a framework, but you know, I think companies and ambition should not be about achieving or complying to a framework. It's really about, you know, what is your company ambition? What's your company purpose? Where do you see your company fitting in terms of industry or sector ambition? And certainly at this critical moment in time, contributing to the Brazilian economy. So I think that there's frameworks and then North Stars that highlight, I think, what are important fundamentals or principles. But I think where we need to be now is what are we practicing as companies? How do you take the matters that are important or material to yourselves and just make them part of your corporate strategy? I think, you know, one of the first key things that we talk about is in anything around sustainable, responsible business, is this something that is done by the business or on the side of the business? Does it have the business leadership at the CEO level, at the board level, certainly at the budgetary or resource allocation level, firmly embedded in what you want to do? I think that is the first piece. I think oftentimes in the practice of sustainable business, thought is given to what you're reporting on or what you're complying to first, as opposed to what is your business strategy and what do you want your business to look like and do. And I think with that flip, we kind of get to a better place around implementation and practice. So, you know, I think just it really builds on from what Jeremy had said. But if I was to talk about some practicals, in terms of moving from theory into practice, I think the first right now is, you know, what are the issues that are most material? And for the Brazilian economy, we've talked about this a lot, you know, climate, what are the opportunities really to seize the momentum on the climate action debate, you know, moving more into renewables, what needs to happen around issues such as the supply side of renewable energy, what needs to happen around the financing of access to renewables, what happens around startup companies and how can they build in green technology into their work, their operations, and their planning, I think is one that's really important. Another topic that I hear a lot of is actually how to address a lot of the social inequalities that exist in the country. You know, what is the role of business in that? You know, one of the most interesting statistics I saw last year, and one that a number of business leaders have come to talk to us about, is the fact that citizens right now expect business leaders to engage on a lot more than simply their P&L. So you could be running a great bottled water company, but your citizens, your customers, your employees will expect you to also take a leadership role on social issues. So I know that CEOs have, literally some CEOs have had the rug pulled out from under their feet from, you know, expectations that they will address issues. You know, so the question here is both as a leader, but also as your products. Do you sell products that are accessible, affordable, of good quality for a broad range of population, I think is a real important critical issue. I think the third, around moving from theory to practice, is how do you govern and how do you lead? You know, one of the pieces of work that we do at the Global Compact is around anti-corruption and governance. And I think the important role that one should play in terms of how your company is governed, run, what you do in terms of inclusivity and equity is equally important. And I think those, for me, are some of the more pertinent issues to look at, and the action that you put in place, and then think about what am I reporting against, and you know, what compliance rate do I have. But I really do think it starts with leadership. It starts with understanding business purpose, why you're there, what your business principles are, and what role you really want to play in your industry and in your society. Without that, I think we end up in a situation where you're simply complying or ticking a box and not really able to move the system change that we need overall.
So I'm glad that you touched on the social issue. I think that's what I want to develop now. Part of our reality here in Brazil is that underprivileged women are most often the ones financially responsible for supporting their families. How can stakeholders from all sectors work together to ensure the social and financial inclusion of the poor? And what are your personal commitments in this regard?
That's a very complex question. And I think it applies to, you know, it probably applies to women all around the world. Let me reflect on some statistics that I saw during the COVID pandemic. The New York Times reported, and this was specifically to women in the US, so mature economy, you know, lots of inclusion of women in the workplace. During the COVID pandemic, 5 million American women left the workplace for a number of reasons. Many of us here, you know, had to leave the workplace or work differently simply because offices were closed, but more importantly, also had to play roles as caregivers, child tutors, etc. You know, a lot of additional domestic work did fall on the female gender to some regard. So in the US, 5 million women left the workplace. There's been relative recovery, people are back at work. Statistics say that 1.5 million of those women will never enter the workplace again because their lives have fundamentally changed. Jobs have been, you know, they've been furloughed, or jobs have been closed, or they simply cannot re-enter because their family or domestic structure changed. Now that's happening within the US. Imagine what then those numbers would be around the world in terms of being shut out of the workplace, primarily due to the fact that there's an added burden occasioned by the COVID pandemic, or simply that the world of work has changed. It's gone digital. You know, workers across both genders, I feel, have been impacted in this regard. So then what happens to the fate of women? And I think it's really important, I'd say, from a business perspective, to take a real, you know, structured and systemic look at the issue of women in the workplace. But, you know, it doesn't start in the workplace. And you talked about, you know, sort of community and personal commitments. A lot of reasons why women never make it into the workplace in the beginning is probably cultural. It's the value that families, communities place on women. Do you want to invest in their education? Are you happy for girls and women to take risks in their education? Are there enough women studying the STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, where lots of great innovation is happening? Are there enough systems to allow women to take appropriate maternity break when they need to and enter back into the workplace? Does your workplace have enough facilities for women to lactate or to breastfeed, you know, maintaining their dignity within the workplace? You know, there's a number of questions that if you look at systemically from the home into the workplace, continue to keep women marginalized and out of their full productive capacity. Some of that can be addressed by policy. Some may require government policy. Others may simply require companies to really take a stand about, you know, the value that they place on women. But a lot of it really just goes back down to communities and the value that communities place on girls and women. But I do think you need to address this at all levels, both in the family, the community, within the company, and depending on where you stand at a national policy level, really making sure that structurally and systemically girls and women have the chance to do what they need to do to prosper and contribute to the economy fairly. I always say, going back to the football analogy, you wouldn't play football with half a team. So why would you leave out half a gender when you're trying to prosper in the world?
Do you want to jump in?
Yeah,
Yes.
let me just build a little bit on Sanda. I mean, I think we all recognize that this is a hugely critical and complicated set of challenges, and you have to tackle it at so many different levels. There's, you know, the social and public, and all the way down to the family. You know, at Systemiq, we have a venture investment arm, along with the advisory work we do. That venture arm is led by an extraordinary woman, and as is our Brazilian office, which I'm thrilled at. And there's a reason for that. First, in both Patricia and the case of Irena, who leads our venture arm, they're extraordinary leaders. But I think what I'm seeing across the work we do around building new sustainable businesses and value chains and companies, and in the public sector, is that there's something about the way women lead. And I don't want to genderize too much, because I think there are extraordinary male leaders, but I think if we want to build a different economy, right, and we're talking about building something that's a regenerative economy, where, as Paul put it, we are actually learning how to collaborate as leaders, not just fine words, but true and deep collaboration. My hypothesis is that we're not going to find the leadership that we need from the same old places that built the old economy, right? We're going to find it from new and different places, right? And I think that those will potentially come from both women more than men. I think we will see a shift, because I think we need to actually build different kinds of economic systems with different mindsets, with more holistic understanding of how to combine economic, environmental, and social value to integrate these different pieces and not always see them as, if you will, linear trade-offs. I think there's a chance that that leadership, one way or another, is going to come from some very different places and from people who have had different life experiences, and not always the privileged life experiences that many of us have had at this point. So don't think that answers your question in anything like the depth it deserves. But I do think that if we're going to see the change I want to see in the economy here in Brazil, in the world, we're going to have to look for new, if you will, leadership from new places. And many of those leaders will be women, and many of them will come from, if you will, unexpected backgrounds, because it's those backgrounds and it's that context and it's a different way of seeing the world that will give us a chance to do things differently going forward. And that it really is not just where half the team needs to come from, but more than half the team going forward.
Right.
Very good, Jeremy. I'm going to read some questions that we got from the audience. We got quite a few of them. Just before I do that, just a short story. I do think that there's a big role for the developing world to participate in ESG implementation. When I was shooting the Expresso Futuro, the TV show series that I do for Futura and Fantástico, I did the last season in Africa. And before that, I had done it in China and the United States and Brazil. And it was amazing to see that some of the countries that I visited, including Mozambique and Tanzania, Kenya, especially in Kenya and Tanzania, connectivity has arrived to vast areas. So there's a lot of populations that now can connect their cell phones in high speed in a lot of places. But the problem has become not the connection. It's where do you charge your cell phone? Where do you find electricity? There's no tomada. There's no outlet where you can plug and charge. And very quickly, you see the implementation of solar panels everywhere. So a lot of places are moving from a situation in which there's no electricity grid to mini grids and solar panel grids. And that I found very transformative. Interesting lesson even for Brazil if we want to lead, and I think we should, the green energy. But with that said, I would like to ask a question that we got from the audience about the risks of not doing anything. So what would be the impact of basically ignoring the agenda, especially for minority populations, or in the case of Brazil, of a majority population, which is the black population of Brazil? What would be the impact of ignoring these questions? It's open to the panel. Feel free to jump in if you'd like.
we go first?
Please.
So, you know, first I was going to comment on the connectivity piece coming from Kenya, but I'll let it go because I think this question is really meaningful. Look, I think, you know, all of us around the world have had a pretty, I'd probably use the word miserable, impactful, devastating last 2 or 3 years, being hit from many sides, not only by the pandemic, by looking at the food and the energy crises. There's been, you know, political turmoil. There's been, you know, it's been an incredible global 2 to 3 years. And I think that, if anything, you know, we've probably learned that how ill-equipped we are in many levels to deal with and respond through crises. So, you know, the cost of inaction, I think, we've probably just seen a little bit of it in our faces over the last 2 to 3 years. That cost, you know, in many countries has played out, such as, you know, decimation of huge numbers of population because health systems were weak, unable to respond. You know, millions of loved ones have been lost across the world. We've seen the fragility of supply chains and the impact that that has had on industries, on small and medium businesses, on households, on economies. We've also seen the fragility of both economic and political systems. I think one of the challenges that I find most distressing around addressing the global crises is actually the lack of solidarity. So, you know, action is not simply the action that you would take at a country level. I think we need to do better across all sectors at understanding we are all interlinked. It's not enough for the global north to prosper if the global south is struggling. In a similar way, you know, it's not enough for one part of the south to prosper if the north isn't. You know, basically the world is one. You know, the cost of inaction will not only negatively impact one part of the world, it'll impact the entire world. So what is at stake here, dear friends, is purely humanity. Sometimes I think it's useful to put numbers and figures at every single thing, which is great if you're, again, very linear and logically minded. But really, we are in a fight for survival at this point in time. And I think every action does count. You know, commitments do need to be credible. If we are looking at, you know, phasing out fossil fuels, we need to be sure that it's done, and it's done within a reasonable horizon, because again at stake is humanity. If we are looking at building more inclusive societies where marginalized economies can get what they need in terms of public good, get their fair share of equity, access to education, health, and others, it must be done, because, you know, we can't have populations that are not benefiting from the public good. So at the end of the day, for me, I mean, that cost of, you know, the cost of inaction is simply its humanity, right at the center of people. And I think the inability to really move forward from a, you know, a very transactional, one-off, incremental pace of change to really addressing proper systems change and understanding that the business models that we were using before, implementing before, simply cannot move us forward in a sustainable manner. It really requires an urgency that I do think we really do need to take on.
So I agree with everything Sanda says. I always agree with everything Sanda says. It's safer that way. But I think I want to just put an edge to answering your question, in the sense that the one thing we know is that every time there's a shock, whether it's an energy price shock, or it's the pandemic shock, or it's food prices, it is the, if you will, the bottom 20, 30% of the population that always get more heavily hit. Every single time, without fail. It is a universal law, right? They are more exposed, they have less resources that can allow the households and families to cope, right, with those shocks. And if we keep on going and we do nothing, then the shocks will simply get bigger. We haven't seen anything yet of the scale that will come if we keep on going the way we're going. Right? The food price shock. There are study after study, and some of them I've even, you know, written, which explain to you that as the climate changes, the risk of what they call a multi-bread basket failure. So you don't have one bread basket failing, but you have multiple failing at the same time, goes from 1 in 40 years to 1 in 30 years to 1 in 20 years to 1 in 10 years. We're now in territory, as we get close to 1.5 degrees of global warming, that multi-bread basket failure will happen somewhere between every 10 and 15 years. The poor in every country, but particularly I think in the global south, but in every country, will get absolutely devastated by the consequences of that. And the feedback loop will not just stay there. It will move into migration patterns, it will move into political unrest, because if there's one thing we also know, it is that when there's a food crisis, it always translates into political unrest. So if we take your question at its face value, which I think is a good place to start, right, and say, we do nothing, right, that's the future, right? The poorest segments of our population and everywhere will get hammered with increasing frequency, which will create an unstable environment politically. And for anybody that also cares about, if you will, the sustained, stable environment that we need to grow prosperous businesses and to build a better economy, that's just terrible news. So let's not go there.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
Yeah, indeed.
I think you have a question, right?
No. Go ahead.
Comments?
No, actually, the whole social issue here in Brazil is obviously completely intensified, right, after the pandemic. I think there is a huge social abyss. It's very hard to bring these people into the economy, real economy. Very hard to qualify them, to equip them to be able to be included in the corporate world, in NGOs, in the public sector. Very hard to address their social and living environment. They are obviously exposed to violence on a daily basis. They are exposed to lack of basic supplies, food, inflation, gas supplies. So again, I think we all struggle. Where do we start, right? Even if everybody is extremely committed, how much do you really move in terms of changing this context, right? So again, I don't think there is an easy answer, right?
There's no easy answer, but funnily enough, the story that you told about what you see in Africa, and of course there's so many, I'm always very hesitant because Africa is so many different, if you will, countries, yeah. And within, if one went to Nigeria, it's many different countries within a single country, so one has to be so careful before one generalizes. But there's no doubt that the connectivity revolution that you were describing is unlocking opportunity for people across that continent. And by the way, the distributed energy revolution, yes, is unlocking opportunity. I mean, I'm involved with a number of the companies, not just the M-Copas, but the Sun Kings, and there's a whole set of phenomenal new companies that are growing up and scaling very quickly because the, if you will, the value that even poorer households perceive in being able to access electricity is worth it to them, right? Because electricity means connectivity. Yeah. So if I apply that to Brazil, and I'm not the expert, there are all of you are more expert than I am. It seems to me that the potential to, if you will, unlock opportunity through the use of digital technology to open up, if you will, new educational businesses.
Access to knowledge, right?
And access to knowledge and access to training. And we know how to train people in new skills and new capabilities, some of which are sitting within the digital sector, but some of which could be sitting in some of these new, if you will, new economy sectors, different ways of doing farming that is much more regenerative. The one thing about regenerative farming, and we've done endless work on this in multiple economies, including here in Brazil, is that you can generate exactly the same yields as, if you will, traditional, more input-intensive agriculture. You can do it with much less, if you will, chemical inputs, fertilizer. We don't need as much fertilizer if we grow regeneratively, and we don't need as much pesticide and all the other, if you will, chemical inputs. But the one thing you do need in a more regenerative agricultural model is that you do need a bit more labor. These aren't jobs that require PhDs and all the other stuff that you guys have in the audience. I don't. Well, I'm just hoping that someone has one out there. But they are jobs that require on-the-ground training, apprenticeship, halfway decent extension services to support that shift. There are millions of jobs available in a regenerative economy, in a more circular economy that is not as wasteful, when we actually capture the value of the waste streams and we hopefully design out waste streams before we generate them. There are millions of good, interesting new jobs that would give, if you will, people who haven't had all the, if you will, benefits of life, a chance to access a different economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think the developing world, and Brazil has a role to play here. When I was in Kenya, I was so impressed by the Silicon Savannah. You have the Silicon Valley, you have the Silicon Savannah, and it's really amazing to see what's going on in the ground. And Africa as a whole is being transformed by three things, right? One of them is demography. It's a very young continent. The average age in the continent is 18 years old. Second thing is connectivity, that is basically everywhere. And third thing is precisely climate change and the transition into greener economies. These are amazing lessons for us to have and look into in Brazil as well. And Maite, I think you have a question for Sanda, is that right?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Sanda, shifting a little bit more to a technical topic now.
I was just having fun with that Africa piece and sticking at the average age and all that, but go ahead.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I could be talking about that the whole seminar, just by the way, but anyway, yeah.
So the lack of universal protocols and standard metrics, not to mention data availability, makes it very difficult to produce reliable reports, threatening the very concept of net zero. In your opinion, what are the main obstacles to elevating the quality and credibility of the information we use in our decision-making?
Right, so back to climate net zero and measurement and accountability. So look, you know, the climate crisis is indeed an urgent one, as we talked about that, Jeremy. I loved your modeling that you had in your presentation earlier about, you know, the climate crisis, and it really is an existential one. I think, you know, science and statistics and, you know, messaging, and we heard from everybody, you know, we do need to take urgent action if we're going to stick to the 1.5 trajectory and really get to where we need to get to by 2030 as well as by 2050. A lot of the emissions lie in a group of economies. We've seen the immense pressure on G20 to really, you know, reduce the emissions in a significant way. We've also done a lot in terms of identifying the sort of high emitting sectors and industries. I mean, the facts are there. I think the biggest challenge we have is understanding how credible commitments are and having frameworks that are as robust as possible to really measure those credibilities. I think this is the same as saying, look, you can't just simply stand up and say, this is what I'm going to do in terms of my contribution to limiting my greenhouse gases. It has to be scientific, it has to be credible, otherwise it really doesn't count. In my comments, I spoke a little bit about the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI, which at present is the verifiable standard for setting and measuring and tracking climate commitments. The UN Global Compact is one of the 4 founding entities behind SBTI. There's not enough companies or entities, indeed, that have their targets verified by SBTI. I think it's just over 2,000 companies. Definitely not enough. It's a drop in the ocean. The concern is, therefore, that there's millions of climate commitments being made worldwide, but we're not sure how credible they are and if they're really leading us onto that 1.5-degree pathway. I'd also made reference to a report that the Secretary General had launched during COP27 in Egypt that is titled Integrity Matters, because that's what it really is. And I think it's an attempt to really, you know, bring it down to what is it. It's not being ultra-scientific. It's about just telling the truth about where your company sits in its climate action pathway and debate. Frameworks, as I say, may not exist for all industries, but, you know, the SBTI framework, I think, aptly covers, you know, enough of what is being targeted within the G20 economies and a number of high-emitting or hard-to-abate sectors. So that's really where the challenge lies. It's about integrity. And I think, what CEO, is comfortable in being questioned about their integrity. And I think the SG's attempt here was to make it as real as possible and as authentic as possible. We're calling on leaders, we're calling on corporate sector leaders, we're calling on government to set their ambition, to keep their ambition, to put the incentives in the right place to enable the shifts that we need to make from renewables. I think Paul said it in his comments, there wasn't enough action at COP around fossil fuels and what was required around truly phasing out fossil fuels. There was a heated debate, which was incredible, around the 1.5 degree target. Some saying that it's too far-fetched, so we should, allow it to slide. No, we should not. I think the markers are there. Science has told us what we need to do to avert this climate crisis. We need to act with integrity. We need to take actions that will keep us on the 1.5 degree path. I think for me, that would be what are some of the most real critical actions in terms of the debate.
Could I just make 2 quick points in adding to that, which is, first, I'm a big fan in measuring well, you only manage what you measure, all of that stuff. At the same time, it's easy to allow perfect measurement to be the enemy of very good measurement. Right? And we shouldn't allow that to happen. We know that there are 1,000 power plants around the world that are responsible for over 20% of emissions. We know that there are another 1,000 industrial sites, right? The big cement plants, the big steel plants, that are responsible for another 20% of emissions. So I can, with 2,000 pinpoint plants, give you over 40% of the world's emissions. Done, right? I don't need an enormous set of frameworks and global agreements. We can measure that stuff. We can measure it from space, right? We have the measurement instruments and the technology to measure precisely those emissions from the 2,000 plants I've just measured. So let's not get carried away that this is an impossible measurement task. Right? There's lots of it that is already measured. The measurement technology, right, including remote satellite, is getting better and better and better. So let's not allow ourselves to hide behind, oh, this is all too difficult. The second thing I'd say is that I do think the financial institutions have an enormous opportunity. Right? You could just say, we're not going to provide loans at these rates unless you give us these numbers. Right? The moment you do that, and I know it's tough, and I know that there's another bank next door that doesn't make the same requirement, and so it's a competitive thing. And I therefore know, and you know, that the only way to do it is to get the top 5 banks in Brazil to come together and say, we're all going to agree to this. We don't need to wait for the government, we don't need to wait for someone else to tell us what to do. We know that this is right. We know, as Sanda says, this is high integrity. We're going to have some basic standards, not for every last company, because the small guys can't do it yet. We all know that, right? Let's not kid ourselves. But for the bigger companies, for companies that have over 100 employees, you pick your metric, get the 5 banks together, agree what is a basic, if you will, pre-competitive rules of the game that aren't going to, if you will, require anybody to make radical shifts, and then give people a year or 2 and some support. And you know what? The banks will end up with companies on their books and on their balance sheets that are lower risk, right? And that is the opportunity that comes with the climate. It's not an ESG compliance story. It's a better risk management. And if we do better risk management, we lower the cost of capital. And if we lower the cost of capital, we make a more prosperous, better managed economy. And it is an opportunity that sits with a group of financial institutions choosing to come together. And I know it's more difficult than what I just said. You're going to explain to me the 5 reasons why it's hard, and I'm going to work with you day in, day out to help you unpick each of those 5 reasons until it happens.
I love the practical advice, so it's great. Thank you.
Excellent. We are heading to the end of our conversation here. And actually, I'm going to use one question that we got from the audience in order to ask you for your final thoughts. And that question is a good one. Like, basically, the person said...
It's not an easy one.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's that easy, but let's see. But the person said the following. Of course, ESG is very important for the planet, and companies are extremely important as actors. But how do you take this topic to politicians and to public agents so that they can also engage. So let's use that for our final considerations. Starting with you, Jeremy. Why not?
It is the right question. So I'm the guy who set up a system change company, right? And what we know is that to get system change at the scale and speed, right? Scale and speed that we need, we have to, if you will, work on policy. We have to work on capital deployment. We have to work on technology. And we have to work on, if you will, the skills and capabilities of people. So we've got to get this whole thing to work together. The politicians in most countries, and I cannot and will not speak for the way it works here, but I'd be surprised if it's radically different, are going, they have a short lifespan, right? I know 4 years or whatever. They're not actually as long-term as many business and leaders or financial institutions. They are worried about doing things that they see as creating a short-term hit in some way or another. And what they need to hear from business and from the financial sector is that we need a policy framework that is transparent and clear, that is directed towards, if you will, a better future, that has economic rationality built into it. So we're putting, if you will, policy signals and public resources behind the value chains that will be the value chains of the future. So they need business. They need the people in this room to not come at them with 100 different lobbying positions, all an inch different from each other, layered with self-interest, but they need key groups of business leaders from the different sectors to come together and say, here's what a better economy, here's what a better, if you will, food and agriculture, if you will, value chain would look like. Mm-hmm. Here's what it could look like. And these are the policies we need. And if you put these policies in place, we'll put our capital to work and we will scale a bigger, better, and if you will, more climate-friendly future. If business doesn't do that, if business doesn't come together and do the analysis and put the evidence together and have a compelling proposition to the politicians about the opportunity and the way to get from A to B and the policies that are needed, then business should not complain if the politicians fail to take action. So it's on us. It's on all of us to create the space and the headroom that will then, I believe, allow politicians to do much more and much better than they're doing today.
Thanks, Jeremy. Let's hear from Sanda, and then Maite will wrap up.
Sure. I mean, I don't think there's any country in the world whose development plan, as articulated by government or politicians, doesn't reflect anything that's in the Sustainable Development Goals or anything that we've discussed today. I think these issues are there and they're real. They're real for governments and they're real for politicians. I mean, you know, around the world, just listen to any political campaign. I'm sure in this year you've heard climate, you've heard sustainability, you've heard social inclusion. These are real things. I think the question now is how to make them real, actionable, and have the outcomes. There's two things that I think that you know, work in, I'd say, politicians' favor globally. One is there's an increasingly interested and engaged private sector, because I think private sector now more than ever realizes the interlinkage between politics, geopolitics, and business. And I don't think private sector can afford to sit away from the table, because these global movements and global happenings are really shaping what the business world looks like. So as Jeremy has said, it's really incumbent on the private sector to make that space, take that space, and sit with politicians and really demonstrate the added value that engaging with the private sector can make in terms of opening up the economy, providing the transformative shifts that are needed, providing frameworks that can allow the leveraging of private finance and private capital to give the scale, the scope, and the speed that we need to address a lot of the transitions that we spoke about in the past hour or so. So I really do feel that the opportunity, if not seized, is definitely now, but it really requires businesses to work in tandem with the private sector on that as a whole. I think that for me is really it. The time is there. It really has to be something that is private sector led. The conversation should not be alien to any political leader or any government itself.
Thank you, Sanda. Maite?
I think there's a lot to process now, right? After such an insightful conversation here, not only for us here, but for the whole audience. So thank you very much, Sanda and Jeremy. It was really a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you, Ronaldo, for moderating the conversation, the whole event. Thank you very much for everybody for coming today. Obrigada, gente. Foi prazer recebê-los.
Thank you, and let's root for Brazil tomorrow.
Brazil.
Please,
Go
don't
Brazil.
forget that part.
Right.
Very important. Thank you so much. So this is the end of our event, so you guys are free to leave if you would like, and I would like to switch to Portuguese back. Pessoal, we have to take a picture before we do that, so
Lovely to meet you.
Let's do this.
You did a lot.
Official picture. Thank you so much. It was really great. Thank you. Thank you, Jeremy. It was really nice. Thanks so much. Thanks, Maite. Thank you. Pessoal, super obrigado. Acho que todo mundo sai daqui com um papo que foi muito legal. E é um privilégio contar com a presença de personalidades como essas que a gente teve a oportunidade de conversar nesse debate de alto nível. Mas, nosso encontro vai chegando ao seu encerramento. Em nome da Editora Globo, do Santander, do Valor Econômico, eu agradeço a vinda dos nossos convidados e a presença de todo mundo que participou aqui conosco. Muito obrigado à plateia que mandou perguntas e o meu agradecimento especial aos realizadores deste evento pela chance de estar aqui e compartilhar esses momentos valiosos com vocês. O registro dessa apresentação vai estar disponível nos canais digitais do Valor Econômico nos próximos dias, tá, pessoal? E, muito obrigado, um prazer estar aqui com vocês hoje, uma ótima tarde, muito obrigado e até o próximo Cidadão Global. Valeu, abraço!